Okay, we are live. It is the weekly roundup at the American Prospect. I am David Dayen, executive editor. With me this week is one of our writing fellows, Janie Ekere. Janie, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Thank you for waving to everybody. As we have mentioned in past weeks, we are on the road for the election. I ran one of the first pieces that we've done, based on field reporting this week, based on the district where I'm at right now, which is Palm Springs, California. Very tight congressional race here. Next week, I'm going up to Montana. I just heard from Luke Goldstein. He's on the road in New Hampshire today. We have Emma Jansen, another writing fellow, going to Wisconsin. Uh, uh, Janie is in North Carolina, lives in North Carolina, and we'll be talking about that later in the show. And I think Mo Tkaczyk is in Ohio right now. So anyway, we are spreading across the country. We need your help to keep doing it. Prospect.org/donate is where you go to give us a hand as we continue throughout the election. We're going to hit the tape running for the next 30 days. So that being said, let's move on to the stories of the week. Obviously, one of the big stories, and as I mentioned, Janie, you're in North Carolina. One of the big stories is Hurricane Helene, which touched ground, I believe, last weekend. And I think the expectation at the time was that this was a hurricane that primarily was going to affect the Gulf Coast of Florida. But as it turned out, some of the worst impacts have been in Western North Carolina. You live there, not in Western North Carolina, but in North Carolina. What are you hearing from news sources in the area, and things like that, about the operations in Asheville, which just has looked absolutely devastating? Other parts of the Appalachian chain there in Western North Carolina.
The main thing has stood out to me is that, the roads are still mostly closed. Like the ability to move from, they have ways to, if you're trying to evacuate Asheville, you can move out through like I-40 and I-26, but actually trying to drive through the region or otherwise is like basically impossible at the moment still.
Mm. Yeah, so you can get, in and out, but getting around in the city or in the smaller towns in the mountains there. I've heard about Appalachian State University, which is in Boone, which is right up against the mountains there. That's just a real area of devastation, as I've been told.
Mm.
Obviously that affects rescue efforts, that affects the ability to get food in, and medical supplies and other needed supplies. I've been told there's been airdrops of some of that material. And then, looking a little further out in the electoral context, I think the mail has been shut down in that area, which obviously, how it's not just the fact that absentee ballots go through the mail, but it's also that there's just no way to find people. I mean, and we should talk about, maybe you could talk about this, like when you're talking about North Carolina, a very close state. Asheville is a very Democratic area with a lot of Democratic votes, right?
Yes, it is. It's, you know, if you want to expand it out to like the county view, like it's Buncombe County as well. That's this, kind of this, if you want to call it like a hub of like Democratic voters in a kind of
Mhm.
area that's surrounded by a lot of red counties.
Right.
And so, the ability to actually like mail in these absentee ballots, like
Hmm.
the delays that, this disaster is causing can make that like a significantly more difficult.
Yeah. And, obviously, this is something that hurricanes have no sort of partisan valence. They affect red areas and blue areas very equally. But I'm sure, a real calamity for organizing, right? I mean, You have people in shelters. Maybe some of them have left if they can afford it. They've left to go to other states. They've left to go to their neighbors. They've left to go to relatives around the country. And so suddenly, this very tight presidential race in North Carolina, there's some upheaval there in this, part of the state that is not insignificant. That you don't know what you're going to get out of it, right? And to the extent that you could do absentee balloting for a lot of people there. I don't know about this, so maybe you can enlighten me if you know. But I don't know what the deadlines are in terms of obtaining it. I know they were passing out absentee ballots right at the time hurricane arrived. That's when they were being distributed. But I imagine the deadline has passed. So if you're someone from Asheville or somewhere in Buncombe County or in any of the 24 counties that have been affected by this, and you have been evacuated, I don't know that there's a way to get absentee ballots so that you can participate in the election.
Yeah, there is kind of on the State Board of Elections website kind of tips about how to get an absentee ballot in, but even then, I think there's still around like nearly 40,000 that have been sent in, but have not been fully processed yet at this point. And so whether they'll be processed in time for the election is up in the air.
I mean, that's the other thing. These State Board of Election satellite offices in these counties, I think some of them haven't opened yet, and it's unclear when they will be able to open. There's a possibility of volunteers who run elections on election day will not be in those particular counties on election day. It just seems like a real mess in a part, in 2012, the what was called Superstorm Sandy hit New York and New Jersey area. I think it also hit the coast of North Carolina, but it went up the coast and hit New York and New Jersey really, really hard. And this was right before the election. The difference is those were states where you knew exactly what the result of the election, at least at the presidential level, was going to be, right? You knew that Obama was going to win New York and New Jersey. North Carolina not only is a potential swing state, but it's a potential determinative state. I mean, if Harris is fighting very hard in North Carolina, and we're going to talk about that next, but if Harris wins that, it's going to be it's very good for her chances because it means that she might be able to lose one of the blue wall states in the Midwest while still winning the election. And if Trump takes that, he makes it very difficult on Harris in terms of she'll have to carry Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and maybe Nevada. So I don't really remember a situation like this where you had a natural disaster come in to a true swing state and have this upheaval affecting this. I mean, what are the political leaders saying? What is being said there in North Carolina about this situation, and are they committing to making sure everyone who wants to participate in the election will be able to do so?
So there have been some, statements made so far. I haven't seen much from, I've mainly seen it from the Harris campaign. I haven't seen much from the governor's race, interestingly enough. There has been a lot of, shall we say, discourse from the Republican side about like Democrats not doing enough in their response. But interestingly, Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, it was reported that he did not vote. He was the only Council of State member who did not vote on the resolution to declare a state of emergency ahead of Helene.
Right. I mean, we're going to talk about Mark Robinson, I'm sure, here at some part of this hour. But that's interesting. And of course, we are seeing the Trump campaign in particular attempt to try to take advantage of this, try to claim that Republican areas aren't being helped, that there's some partisan sort of overlay on where the rescue operations are happening. And first of all, I mean, the first thing to say, as we have said on this, is that this one of the major counties that was affected by this is a Democratic hub in North Carolina, right? So that's number one. And number two, it's gotten so bad that I just caught this today that on the FEMA website, they literally had to put up a page debunking rumors that certain areas weren't being helped, rumors that FEMA's run out of money, rumors that they're turning away volunteers. All of this stuff that you're hearing in the right wing fever swamps about the way in which the operation is going, which is really really unfortunate. And even President Biden kind of lashed out this week and said how irresponsible this was, and it actually, and who it really hurts are the people who are in this situation trying to survive, because they're being given bad information about what help is available to them. And so, if they accept the Republican narrative here, then they're actually going to be at a disadvantage in getting the help that they deserve. So it's sadly, we don't have any area of our country where partisanship doesn't seep in or play a role. Is that, are there efforts like in local news or in what you're hearing in the state to sort of give clear information to people who are affected by this?
Yeah, so there's efforts through local news, but also, as I kind of briefly mentioned before, like state board of elections, like official, like government
Mm-hmm.
websites to give like accurate information about road closures or,
Yeah.
mail delivery and things like that, and where to find help if you need it.
Great, great. Okay, well, obviously we're going to keep up with that. I think we're going to have some reporting on that next few days. One of the things, just to turn to the election side of this, one of the things that we're seeing in North Carolina this year that, I mean, it's been a close state in recent years, but Democrats have seemed to not quite be able to get over the hump there. Obama won North Carolina in 2008, lost it in 2012. It's gone Republican ever since. There's a litany of examples of close but no cigar Senate races where Democrats just almost get there and lose. Ever since Kay Hagan lost, which I believe was 2014, every subsequent race has been close, but they haven't been able to actually get them to win. I know that you have been looking at organizing in the state, particularly union organizing, and which is interesting because you don't think of North Carolina as a high density union state. So, what are you seeing? Who have you talked to in terms of what the organizing that is happening is going on?
So I've been talking to SCIU, which is the Service Employees International Union. And I think having a union that specifically, is targeted towards like service workers is, pretty significant, because I think the labor movement coverage that we've seen has been, kind of focused on like auto workers or like
Mm-hmm.
manufacturing, like those types
Mm-hmm.
of fields. And so having those jobs that have historically are way less unionized, especially in a state that has such low union membership density,
Right.
is really huge.
So, what are they doing in North Carolina?
Well, they kicked off a canvassing effort last weekend that they started off with a rally at Waffle House, which is a pretty infamous
Right.
throughout the South for, its lack of safety, especially like you've heard probably a lot of stories about like drunken fights and people carrying guns and hurting
Right.
workers. So that was, I think, a very smart move for them to start in front of Waffle House. But they started with a rally in front of Waffle House and then subsequently went on a canvassing effort where they, knocked on doors. This was in Concord, North Carolina, by the way, so it wasn't affected by the storm.
Okay.
But
Where's Concord? Is that in the center of the state?
yeah, about that, a few miles out from Charlotte. So about like
Got it.
central North Carolina. So they went door knocking, kind of asking people, you know, what they felt were some of the most important issues in this election and sort of making the case for, you know, the Harris Walsh ticket to be sort of the most economically friendly, most worker friendly choice on the
Mhm.
ballot.
Well, it's interesting. Two things come to mind. Number one, Kamala Harris has a long-standing relationship with SEIU. LaFonza Butler, who is a senator now, was the head of SEIU's local in California, and was worked very closely with Harris in that time, and still is a key surrogate for her. So, that's just one example. But the union that has historically been closest to Harris has been SEIU. And that's, they have a big presence in California with home health workers. They have a big presence with nurses, and other things of that nature. So the second thing that comes to mind is when you mention Waffle House, because there is this sort of emerging effort to organize the South. And the organization that's tied to SEIU that's doing that is called the Union of Southern Service Workers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the places that they're really working on trying to organize is Waffle House. And we actually did the story. I think it was Macy Stacher, one of our interns, wrote this story about Waffle House and the particular thing that they're doing, which is really a form of wage theft, which is they charge people for, if you work a shift, they charge you for a meal, whether you actually take advantage of that and eat a meal at Waffle House or not. So every time you're working, and in a lot of these states, the minimum wage is what, $7.25 an hour, and they might be under the tip minimum wage, which is $2.13 an hour. And a large part of their paycheck in that case is going towards this meal that they might not even be getting. And so it's a form of wage theft. And this has been a primary part of the campaign, as I understand it. And so it's interesting that the Union of Southern Service Workers is also engaging in some organizing. Obviously, what we've seen out of the Biden administration in terms of its National Labor Relations Board appointments, in terms of its union friendliness, Biden walked a picket line, is something that is expected to continue in a Harris administration. And in that case, it's going to be easier to organize things like Waffle Houses, which are franchises. But, there's now I'm going to get really complicated, but there's something called the joint employer rule, which means that if you want to organize a McDonald's franchise, for example, you can say that the true owner of this is McDonald's. It's not, Joe who owns this McDonald's that happens to be in this one particular city. It's McDonald's, and so we're going to organize with McDonald's, or we see them as the management. And the same thing for grievances or anti-union violations, unfair labor practices, things like that. We charge McDonald's with them, not the individual franchisee. And so that could be a way to also do Waffle House, right? Which is also a franchise that's owned by individual people, but ultimately the true employer is Waffle House. So those two things kind of come to mind in thinking about that. It's pretty interesting. What? So you've been talking to SEIU. Do you know of other efforts that are happening in North Carolina to get out the vote? I'm sure that the Harris campaign has a major, quite a robust effort. I know that people who are calling all over the country are calling into swing states, and I imagine North Carolina is one of them.
Yes, so I do know of one other one that mainly focus around the college campuses, specifically the HBCUs. So
Mm-hmm.
motivating particularly young Black voters, college age Black voters.
And what is that effort called? Is that the Black Voters Matter thing, or what is that?
No, I don't think it was part of
Or
that
is that with
specifically, but I think it was his own thing.
right? Is that affiliated with the Harris campaign, or is that an
Yes, it
independent effort?
is.
Oh, it's affiliated with. Okay,
Yeah.
very good. Okay, interesting. Obviously, the big story out of North Carolina, other than the presidential race, is this whole situation with Mark Robinson, who did not get out of the race. He stayed in the race. You wrote about sort of his origin story, like how he became lieutenant governor of North Carolina and the gubernatorial candidate. Talk to us about that,
Yeah. Oh wow. There's so much I could say that it didn't even make it into the piece. But
please.
I'll start with, what I actually wrote. So I thought it was important to sort of talk about not just the remarks that he made, but also kind of how he, got his start. So he says on his campaign website, like he kind of presents himself as like this, working class man. He talks, says it how it is. He was the ninth of 10 children to a single mother. Um, and he was mainly picked up as a potential candidate for lieutenant governor after he spoke at Greensboro City Council about gun rights. And that was directly after the Marjorie Stoneman, the school
Douglas, yeah,
shooting that
the
happened in
Parkland's
Florida
the
at that time.
Parkland, Florida shooting, and
Parkland, yes.
you're in Greensboro, right? And so it's a good sized city, but this is like a city council meeting in in a city that suddenly within 2 years he becomes the lieutenant governor of the state. How do you go from just making a comment at a city council meeting all the way up to that?
Well, I think his choice to specifically talk about gun rights when he says in the speech, like it's kind of surprising because the talking points he uses are pretty common. The whole, well, why are they coming for our guns? We didn't do the shooting.
Right.
We're law-abiding citizens. I do think that does have a lot of appeal, even if it is kind of like bogged standard Republican talking points. But I think he was you know, someone who was regarded as this very like powerful and very convincing speaker. And so I believe at that time was Representative Mark Walker who
Right.
recommended that he run for lieutenant governor
Mm.
because of that. And I think there was also kind of the layer of, and I wrote about this as well, wanting to sort of escape the past reputation that the um, North Carolina GOP had of being like very racist. They had
Hmm.
one of the most famous figures was the late Jesse Helms, who was a very important figure in the sort of the founding of the modern conservative movement and had his own
Yes.
history of anti-Semitism, of racism, of a whole bunch of other bigotries as well. And so
Yeah.
I think the thought process at the time was, having the state's first black lieutenant governor would be a way to sort of move past all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a very famous ad in 1990 that Jesse Helms ran. Harvey Gantt, who was the mayor of Charlotte, African American, was running against him. And Jesse Helms, the ad is called Hands. And you just see a man's hands, and it says, you wanted that job. You thought you were going to get it, but because of affirmative action, you didn't get that job. And it was a really provocative, racist ad, really, about how black people are getting jobs instead of you. And and he ends up winning that race and staying in the Senate. So yeah, the Helms legacy there looms obviously pretty large. So yeah, having a Republican black, uh, 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 you know, figure of some renown is obviously seems like it would be attractive. And maybe that's everything that Republicans in North Carolina saw. Like, hey, this would be good. This guy seems like he knows the talking points. So why don't we just go with him? And then what do they learn? What do they find out after he gets in? I mean, they don't find it out for 4 years, right? Because he's just lieutenant governor and he gives a bunch of red meat speeches, and they love that. And really that's more important than policy to them, is like owning the libs and giving a bunch of speeches, and then once he runs for higher office all of this stuff comes out. but what you say in the piece, which I think is interesting, is that a lot of this was already out there before the big sort of precipitating event, which was these comments on a adult website. Um, a lot of this other stuff is broadly in line with what comments that he's already had made in the past.
Yeah. And even at the time of the lieutenant governor's race, he had made some very controversial comments. One of the ones I pointed out was him labeling the 1960s Greensboro sit-ins, those sit-in protests as some sort of like plot to kill the free markets. And
Right,
so he'd
right,
been making these kind of comments for a long time, but I think at the time there just was the lieutenant governor's race was, and even this,
sure,
the lieutenant governor's race is happening this year. I don't know how many people even in the state know that there is one. So it's not
right,
it's not a race that gets a lot of attention anyway.
right.
So I think that
Yeah,
was
I think
part of
that's
how he's able
what's
to get. I think that was part of how he's able to get away with it for so long.
Yeah, I think that's right. Suddenly when it's a high profile, it's really the only swing state gubernatorial race on the ballot this year. Most of the swing state gubernatorial races are during midterms. So, there's a greater spotlight because it's not just, there just aren't that many governor's races happening. And North Carolina is in the spotlight because of the presidential race. So this obviously the Harris campaign, it's to their advantage to point out this guy, especially because Trump has endorsed him. He's compared him to Martin Luther King, I believe. Called him MLK on steroids or something like that. Yeah. And so it was just the stage was going to be bigger for this guy, and he wasn't going to be able to sort of hide behind whatever. I think that's definitely a key part of it. Um,
Yeah.
and so now what are we saying? I mean, he's obviously down by double digits in a closely contested state. Um, is this affecting other races on the ballot, do you think?
It's kind of hard to say. I know for me, I'm looking into the House District 1 race, which is also one of the only other competitive races that's happening in the state,
Mm-hmm.
between Representative Don Davis and his Republican opponent, Lori Buckout.
Mm-hmm.
Um, from what I've seen, there has been, some effort to try to sidestep the whole controversy from, at least from the Republican side of that race.
Mm-hmm.
They had some associations before, but I think what Buckout is trying to do is sort of downplay and to sort of redirect in a way that Robinson can't really do at the moment.
Right. And is Davis like, are there ads that they're where he's trying to tie his opponent to Robinson? Are we seeing that? I mean, I know we're seeing that at the presidential level, right? There are Harris ads that use Robinson very specifically.
Um, I haven't seen that much from the House District 1 race specifically, not that
Okay,
specifically tries to tie. There's some, but it's not a huge part of the strategy as far as I've seen.
okay, okay. But it is a strategy at the presidential level. I don't know how successful that's going to be. I think people have their experience with Trump, I think, is kind of untied to Mark Robinson. I don't think they sort of blame Trump for the rise of this guy who's obviously unfit. So we'll see what happens there. But clearly, the Harris campaign, is trying to get any advantage they can in North Carolina. So let's switch gears here. We over the last it wasn't this week, but it was actually last week when we ran our stories from the magazine, the October issue that we just put out, and that in particular had to do with basically the stakes of the election between Trump and Harris on a variety of different policies. And we tried to use some policies that were kind of off the national radar. We didn't do a piece on abortion. We didn't do a piece on taxes or those kinds of issues. But one of the ones that we did, and you actually wrote it, was about the two candidates on rural policy. So let's start talking about that. Where do you see the distinctions there? What did you point out in your piece that was different between Trump and Harris on those issues?
Yeah, so what I tried to do with the rural piece was I did talk a lot about like agriculture and sort of teasing out the different aspects of that because that is, while it's by no means the only important aspect of policy when it comes to rural, it is a big one and it covers a lot of ground. So it covers not only like food production itself, but also corporate monopolization, trade policy, and even climate change. And
Sure.
so as far as those go, well, we can start with let's say climate change. Looking through Project 2025 and looking through what has been said about, things like sustainable agriculture, that is specifically cited as an obstacle to economic growth or allowing, you know, for these farmers to freely produce. And so that is something that's immediately on the chopping block if Trump were to become president. But the Biden-Harris campaign has done quite a bit to make it easier for growers and producers in these areas to switch gears and sort of switch to more climate-friendly agricultural practices. And that is something that will likely continue if Harris becomes president.
Yeah. So that, I think too often, and I think what was good about your piece is that too often we associate rural policy just with agriculture, right? And it's an important part of rural life, and obviously there is a lot of agriculture that is out there in those parts of the country. It is a major part of the economy there, and we should talk about it. And I think you did a good job of that. Um, uh, Not just on the point of climate smart, but also, yeah, exactly, these large companies, agricultural interests, whether it's at the output level of being producers or at the input level, seeds and farm equipment and things of that nature. Uh, the farmer is sort of sits at the center of a lot of major forces in the economy and major companies that have built up around it. And it's kind of, the farmer is kind of beset on all sides by large monopolies, essentially. So I think that's an important part of it too. But you also talked about other things, so let's try to get into those. Things like what healthcare is like in rural America.
Yes. So as far as healthcare goes, there is a disproportionate, or let me rephrase, people
Mhm.
in rural areas disproportionately rely on Medicaid because
Right.
they tend not to be able to afford private insurance, or there may be fewer employers that offer their own insurance. And so Medicaid is often what people in these areas depend on, and hospitals as well, depending on Medicaid in order to fund their operations and to offer services.
Mhm.
So when one of the sources that I spoke to had talked about plans that Republicans had to voucherize Medicaid to sort of turn it into more of an individualized marketplace where you sort of purchase your own coverage, but that would make health insurance significantly more expensive. And because of that, it's more likely to happen rather than people, just buying it individually, is that they would defer care due to the cost. And when health services are, especially, and I mentioned this in the piece, especially when it comes to reproductive services or OBGYNs,
Right.
delaying care in that area can have potentially fatal consequences.
Yeah. And it's not just the insurance side of the equation, but it's also the provider side of the equation. I mean, there are so many what we would call healthcare deserts across the country, where rural healthcare, rural hospitals have closed. There's been an epidemic of that for years and years and years. Or the kind of forces that are involving themselves in healthcare, like private equity, buys up hospital networks, and then they close the worst performing ones. And inevitably, some of those are in rural areas. So, if you're someone in that part of the country and you're sick, you have to think about, okay, do I want to drive 100 miles to get a checkup? Maybe I'll defer and I'll wait until, this becomes a bigger problem. And it's the same kind of thing that you're talking about. If you don't have insurance, you also defer, and those problems fester and they get worse when you actually really need the help. So it's a very similar kind of situation. We have a question here from Jules, and I don't know that you actually got to this in your piece, but maybe you know something about it. Jules says, how severe has charter schools overwhelmed or decimated public schools in rural areas? What are your thoughts on education in rural America?
So I was not able to address this much in the piece, but I did speak with someone about this, kind of in the background.
Mhm.
Um, we didn't get the chance to talk much about charter schools specifically, but there are some major issues with public schools in rural areas. The one that I remember speaking about with him, his name is Dr. Allen with I think the Rural Schools Collaborative, but don't quote me on
Mm,
that.
okay.
Um, the infrastructure for a lot of these schools is often neglected. There just isn't enough funding to sort of build them back up so that children can
Mm.
actually go to school.
Right. So we've already talked about medical deserts, and now, at some level we're talking about education deserts, right? Upgrades and things like that, are kind of just as there's deferred healthcare, there's deferred maintenance. They just, it's much easier to just sort of go along with the same one room schoolhouse or whatever that you've been attending for years, and problems crop up. One of the big problems with COVID was ventilation. Um, I'm out here in California where we've had just enormous heat waves. It's October 1st, which was 3 days ago. It was 117 here in Palm Springs. And a lot of these schools, even in California, a lot of schools do not have air conditioning because of prior weather patterns, particularly on the coast. Just, in past climates, it wasn't needed as much. And so they build up without air conditioning, and there's a big school maintenance and repair bond on the ballot in California this year for that reason, because the capital expenditures have just not been there in terms of schools. And I think that problem is probably even worse in parts of rural America. We have rural California, by the way. I mean, it's certainly a problem here too, but it's a sort of ongoing problem of updating and upgrading the schools. And during COVID, we understood even more so why, because schools that had poor ventilation ended up being schools that were more magnets for COVID outbreaks. Okay, so what am I forgetting about what else you covered in that story? We've got through healthcare, we got through agriculture, but there was other stuff, right?
Um, there
There's
were
climate.
other sort of details within those. So part of what I wrote for the healthcare section was also talking about SNAP. So the
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah.
supplemental nutrition assistance program. And the what I wrote about that was in areas where the cost of food is lower, SNAP tends to stretch further, and a lot of those areas are rural. So
Yeah.
being able to purchase healthy, fresh food does make a huge difference in your healthcare outcomes. But one of the issues is being able to access this healthy food in the first place. So even if you have, you know, money from SNAP, if you don't have access to healthy food, it doesn't make that much of a difference, because what will happen a lot of time is a lot of rural areas are also food deserts. We've been talking about like healthcare deserts,
Right.
educational deserts,
Right.
food deserts is another issue. And so you may be in a situation where you have to travel some, 50, 100 miles to your nearest grocery store, or your only source of food nearby is a dollar store. And those usually sell, very heavily processed foods.
Yeah, just going back to the Union of Southern Social Service Workers, dollar stores like Dollar General are on the agenda for that as well. And one of the big problems there is lack of staffing. I mean, sometimes one person runs the entire store. They aren't huge stores, but you know, one person that's difficult. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think overall what we're saying is we're talking about a lack of infrastructure, whether it's healthcare infrastructure, whether it's just sort of basic necessity infrastructure, things like grocery stores or access to food, whether it's educational infrastructure. These are some of the major problems in rural America. It's just has not been built up to the extent that it's been built up in the rest of the country. And then the other thing that is, I think, interesting is that for years, the way that SNAP gets funded is through a thing called the Farm Bill, and for many years, that has represented kind of a bargain. We actually had Luke Goldstein wrote a feature about this at the beginning of the year. A bargain between rural agricultural interests and urban, usually big city Congress members who look after SNAP. And that's kind of been the way that it's been sort of doled out. You get these bargains where, yes, you can do some crop insurance and agricultural supports to keep farmers in balance when they have good years and bad years, but also we're going to spend heavily on SNAP so that people, including people in big cities, have access to fresh food. But what strikes me in what you're saying is that it's not so divided, right? There's just as much, maybe more, of a need on the SNAP side in rural areas, and the people who represent those areas, who are probably more looking out for getting crop insurance and farm insurance to agricultural interests, including CAFOs and big agricultural feeding operations, should probably pay more attention to their own constituents who really need need big boosts in the SNAP side of things. So okay, well, it was a great piece, and I like what we did in that issue in terms of finding those topics that weren't completely on the radar. You didn't hear about them in like the vice presidential debate this week. You didn't hear about them kind of in the main topics of conversation, but they're really important. Things like veterans healthcare, things like the Interior Department and public lands and what we do with our public lands. They just haven't been top of mind in the election, but they're really important. And I'm glad that we were able to cover them and look at the two candidates on those issues. So thank you for that. We got about 15 minutes left. I mentioned the vice presidential race. I don't know if you watched it or had anything to say about JD Vance and Tim Walz this week.
Yeah, honestly, I was kind of surprised at how much focus there was on how normal the debate was.
Right.
There was a lot
Why
of
do you say
focus on
that?
there was a lot of focus on the fact that, both candidates involved were like respectful towards each other. And, there wasn't any name calling. Things had to not get that heated. But as I've
Says
seen,
something about our politics, right? That like,
yeah,
hey, they didn't call each other jerks. Like that's the big headline, right, coming out of the race. But anyway, go ahead.
yeah. But I think a major criticism that I saw, um, and it's related to the lack of live fact checking, was the fact that JD Vance, you know, was very dishonest about a lot of things, including, the transfer of power during the 2020 election. And I think that that kind of got obscured because there was this kind of like obsession with how civil the debate was. And I remember seeing a lot of discussion and discourse about this, like around the time that Trump was first getting elected and in the aftermath of his election, kind of this competing desire between wanting normalcy and civility
Mhm.
versus needing to be more aggressive, if you want to call it that, about making sure, not normalizing these very dangerous beliefs just because they're presented in a reasonable or mild mannered sort of way.
Yeah, I agree with that. There were two or three areas that I saw that. I mean, you mentioned one, which is, Vance kind of playing off the threat to overturn the election by saying, "Hey, he gave over power on January 20th, neglecting everything that happened up until January 20th, particularly January 6th." Right. So that's number one. Another one was Vance talking about how the Trump campaign or Trump administration, the future Trump administration, would bring back manufacturing to America, neglecting the fact that we are in the midst of the biggest construction boom of manufacturing facilities in American history in terms of a dollar amount. And that never came up, never was part of the conversation. And then the third one that comes to mind is Vance talking about abortion and saying that, my party needs to gain the trust of the people on this issue. Um, uh, you know, on his own website, up until maybe the day before the debate, there was his full-throated support of a national abortion ban, his support of being 100% pro-life. He tried to sidestep and dodge all of that stuff during the debate. And yeah, I mean, part of that has to do with, uh, you know, what the debate moderators were willing to intervene on. But part of it also is on Tim Walz, right? I mean, he knew going in what the ground rules were going to be, and he knew that he would be the one who would have to step up and challenge Walz or challenge Vance, and to a large extent, he didn't do a whole lot of that. I mean, he did get in, I think, what's the most important part of the debate, which is he said, will you accept the results of the 2024 election? Or I'm sorry, it's more, did you accept that Donald Trump lost the election in 2020? And Vance dodged that. He said, I want to look forward. And that, I think, was the biggest headline. I think they cut an ad about it already. That was certainly the biggest part of this. But in other parts, I think Walz missed some opportunities to say the kinds of things that, we just laid out about those various topics that where Vance was kind of dodging or rewriting history.
Yeah, I think in the presidential debate between Harris and Trump, Harris had done, there was like some like fact checking in that one, so I think it helped. But she was a lot more proactive in trying to correct
Yeah.
some of the things that Trump had said or was trying to push during the debates. And it is a little, I did find it interesting that Walton didn't do that so much.
Yeah, I mean, he was trying to sort of be above the fray, be a sort of genial figure. You know, I think a lot of the commentary that you talked about it being, sort of a kinder and gentler debate was because Walz was perfectly willing to keep it on those terms. He has he's the most popular figure in terms of just sort of general approval rating in the race, and that includes Trump and Harris. And he sought to maintain that, and he did by and large. If you look at post debate polling, it looks like the debate itself was a draw, but Walz's popularity went up, so did Vance's, but Vance was coming from a lower position. So ultimately, I don't think it's going to matter a whole lot, but to the extent that Walz had more opportunities to keep Vance's negative stuff up, he didn't take those shots. So that was interesting. As I mentioned before, we are heading out across the country to these various areas where there are battleground races going on. You can help support that at prospect.org/donate. I guess in the 10 minutes or so that we have left, I'll talk about the race that I looked at this week. It's here in the Coachella Valley of California, but it's also in a part of the state called the Inland Empire. And in Ken Calvert is the incumbent, and he's the longest serving member of the California delegation. He's actually served longer than Nancy Pelosi. He's been a congressman since 1992, and he always served the Inland Empire part of this district. But after 2020, the redistricting process, it added a couple towns, desert cities like Palm Springs, like Palm Desert and Rancho Mirage. You know, Palm Springs in 2018 was the first city anywhere in the country to have an all LGBT city council. It's a very pro LGBT area. And Calvert's record throughout his entire career, where he served in pretty right-wing Republican districts, was very anti-gay. And, he supported Prop 8 and just all of that down the line. And suddenly, in 2022, after he got Palm Springs in his district, he reversed all of that. He supported the Respect for Marriage Act, which is the bill that was passed in 2022 to codify the Supreme Court's ruling on same-sex marriage. So he's completely shape-shifted on that. What he hasn't really changed his view on is a thing called earmarks. These are specific programs for your particular district that you can insert into appropriations bills. And they were taken away because of corruption issues in 2011, but they came back in 2022. And immediately when they came back, Calvert put in about $100 million in earmarks. And Calvert has this unfortunate history of submitting earmarks for parts of his district that are very close to real estate properties that he owns. And this has happened over and over again, so much so that I actually found a Fox News 7-minute segment on Ken Calvert earmark corruption that ran in 2008. So even Fox News said this is a real problem with what this guy is doing. You know, he'll put in an earmark to improve a road, and the road is adjacent to a property he had, and the property goes up 79% in value, and he sells it within 6 months of getting the earmarks passed through Congress. His opponent is a guy named Will Rollins. He is a federal prosecutor. He's from the Palm Springs part of the district. He's LGBT. He is running on this corruption issue very, very hard. And you'll see signs around here in Palm Springs. I've seen them, 2 or 3 of them, that say "End Corruption, Will Rollins." So he is really making this a centerpiece of his campaign, as he did. He ran in 2022 as well. That was a shorter campaign because he got into it a little late, and he lost by about 4 points. The district is almost a toss-up between Trump and Biden in 2020, if you look at those numbers. And he loses by 4 points in the midterm. But there's going to be a much higher turnout, he thinks, this year. 80% of the district is still not in the Palm Springs area. It's the big cities are Corona and Lake Elsinore and Menifee. It's the Inland Empire part of the district. And so he's really focusing on that part. It's about 80% of the voting population. And his other big issue that he's talking about a lot is housing. And he's been trying to connect this public corruption, which does involve real estate, even though it's mostly commercial real estate. But he's trying to connect it to housing. He said in one ad, Ken Calvert got rich while your housing costs went up. He's trying to make those connections there. And he's also talking about corporate landlords, corporate home builders that use that buy up land and artificially keep it off the market so that the remaining housing stock goes up in value and therefore it becomes more expensive to rent and to buy. So he's talking about those issues. And so there's sort of a corruption angle to how he's talking about housing as well. And that further strengthens that tie to public corruption in the case of Ken Calvert. So that's pretty much the race. One of the, there are about 4 or 5, maybe even 6 seats in California that are controlled by Republicans right now in the House that could flip to Democrats, and that would be more than the entire margin in the House right now between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats have a 4-seat deficit to make up, and there are at least that many in California. So California could really be pretty determinative to who controls the House next year. And so, these seats are really critical. And housing in Southern California in particular is a big issue. And so it's interesting to see how Rollins is trying to work within that. So that's why I wrote about. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's what I did this week.
Yeah, actually, there is something I wanted to bring up, and I know that the district where this race is happening is like most of it is happening outside of Palm Springs. But the thing that I found interesting is that housing is such a huge, affordable housing is such a huge issue, like everywhere, obviously, but especially within the LGBTQ community, there is a large portion of youths in the community, especially who are homeless, and so the ability to, get some form of housing is very important. So if Will Rollins, that could be an interesting angle to potentially explore, like if whether we're talking about like him on the campaign side or people reporting on it, that could be a
on the
very
youth
interesting.
on the youth side and also on the senior side. I mean, here
Yeah.
in Palm Springs, we've seen a few LGBT senior living communities pop up in the last couple of years, and where there weren't any before. And that I think is an emerging issue in this particular area. So yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to explore, and maybe he will continue with that. So far, he's been really focused on housing and really focused on corruption, but I think this is a way to get into a broader set of issues. And obviously, he's talking about abortion. He's talking about some of the core economic issues that we're seeing in races across the country. Great. Well, Janie, this was excellent. Thank you so much for your reporting. Thank you for coming on the show. And you're going to be down there in North Carolina looking at some of these key races in one of the prime swing states. I mean, this is one of the good things that we happen to have someone located in North Carolina. Ryan Cooper, our managing editor, is based in Pennsylvania. We have Emma Jansen's in Chicago, not far from Wisconsin. She's going to Wisconsin. Harold Meyerson is taking a trip to Nevada. I may be going to Arizona. So there is, we're kind of blanketing the swing states here, the key swing states that are going to be critical to this election. We have some presence there, and we're going to continue to be reporting on that. As I mentioned one last time, prospect.org/donate if you want to help us get to these battlegrounds and give you the information you need to understand this election. So we will put this on the website at prospect.org. And every week we're here for the weekly roundup at 12:30 Eastern. So thank you very much for hanging out with us, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.